Good afternoon, everybody. Boy, Texas is something else. You all are some bizarre people. No, I mean, you all have in the room, man, I applaud you. You have those people. You have black folks, white folks, Latino folks, Republicans, libertarians, cops, people who want to get high, Texas, you know, I have to tell you, when I came in last night, my plane was delayed, and Pamda picked me up from the airport. Pamda, she's a board member, and talking about the virtues of Texas, she had me questioning why I live in New York and not in Texas. Incredible. All right, I have to first say that I am humbled by the people who are up here and the folks who received awards before me. And I have to remember that, because oftentimes when I speak, I go in places where I'm speaking to enemies or people who don't want to hear what I have to say. As Joy mentioned, places like the O'Reilly factor. No disrespect, actually, because Bill O'Reilly, you know, he understands what he does, and he understands that it's entertainment. Most people in the country don't, but he gets it well, and actually I like talking to him a lot better than I like talking to the people at CNN, because they actually think that what they're doing is news. And so, so I am humbled to be here, and I think that you all have a lot more deserving people than me to be receiving an award. Actually, Joy, you should be receiving an award. Don't get me wrong, I really appreciate it, and I'm trying to do my best to change things. I'm trying to do my best in part because of examples made for me. We can think about Martin Luther King, we can think about Fannie Lou Hamer, we can think about James Baldwin, all those guys, you know them. But back in 2000, about 2000, I was watching a video, and it was on what was going on in Tulia, Texas. And there was a minister speaking so eloquently about the issue and how disturbed he was about this. And he's here. And those kind of people made me want to do what I do. And so I'm humbled to be here with him. I'm humbled by people like Brian coming out of the closet about his drug use. So, so I guess at this point, one of the things I'd like to do is just say thank you. Thank you, Joy, for having me. And I will try to help you all understand how I got involved and what I do and what I'm doing. In doing so, I think it will be important for you all to understand who I am now and who I was. Now, one of the sort of simple ways to characterize who I am is that I'm the first African-American tenured professor in the sciences at Columbia University. And so, please. That is not reason to applaud, please. In 2014, we should not be having a first, and please don't do that. We should be asking the question, why the hell is that the case? No applause for that. So the question is, how did I get from point A, the hood, where I'm growing up in South Florida, Miami, to where I am now? That's the question. When I was growing up, I want to make it clear that I wasn't perfect. In fact, this organization is called Mothers Against Teen Violence. I was one of the biggest proponents of teen violence. I was the biggest participant in teen violence. I sold drugs, I used drugs, I engaged in petty crime and so forth. I tell you this not like a badge of honor like the rappers do. That's not the goal here. I tell you this so you understand what real diversity is, so that you understand that we need to have people from a wide range of backgrounds. So when we talk about solving problems, we have people there who actually might understand something about the problem. That's why I tell you this. But I lost friends, families, members, and so forth who are incarcerated, who were killed in this sort of growing up in the environment in which I grew up. The question is, how does one get out of those situations? How does one survive? A number of people are currently in those situations today, and I hope my story provides some answers, some help, some guidance for people who are in those situations today. One clue for me is I have 5 older sisters, and this is just a picture of my siblings and my mom. My 5 older sisters kind of served as surrogate mothers, and they ensured that I didn't stray too far off of the mainstream sort of beaten path, even though I participated in those other activities that I described. But they tried their best to make sure I stayed close. And they also had boyfriends who were older, and they served as sort of male role models, although I hate that term role models, because the way it's used is as if people who are role models in one domain, they can serve as a role model in another domain. That's not how it works. You are a role model in some specific domain and for some specific purpose. So you don't have to be perfect to be a role model. But anyway, my sisters really helped. Another sort of reason or method that helped me survive was governmental programs. You know, the ones that we all attack these days, welfare. We were on welfare throughout my childhood, and my mother raised 8 children on welfare. We are all now tax-paying citizens, and so welfare, as we know it, is no longer with us as a result of Bill Clinton's sort of '96, I think, crime Act policy. That's no longer with us. So as we criticize these programs, remember that these safety nets were not for these safety nets. You wouldn't have people like me. Another sort of component or thing that helped me get past was high school athletics. In order to play on a high school basketball team, one had to maintain high standards. I think we had to maintain a C, grade point average, quite high. Well, maybe not in Texas, but in Florida it was quite high. So that was really helpful because I thought that I was going to get a basketball scholarship and go to college, even though I wasn't really into learning at that time, at least not academic learning. So I didn't get the basketball scholarship that I thought I would get. As a result, I had a guidance counselor who took a special interest in me, and she encouraged me to talk to the military recruiters. She knew what I responded to, and so she said, okay, you talk to these recruiters, every day you talk to the recruiters, I'll let you out of school for the entire day. And so I ended up going to the Air Force. Almost 30 years till the day was the first time I stepped foot in Texas. And that was the time that I joined the Air Force. And 1984, it was actually August 1984, I came to Dallas, Texas, took a bus to San Antonio to Lackland Air Force Base, and that's where I began my real education and my military career. I spent most of my time outside of the country, which was a blessing. Most of my time was spent in England. In England, well, actually before England, I started to go to school, but in England, I really intensified my college education. The U.S. military has the University of Maryland on many of its bases overseas, and so I went to college in the Air Force. While in England, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about American racism in ways that I hadn't learned in the United States. You see, the British didn't have many qualms about criticizing America for its shortcoming. So they were happy to point out problems with our race relations because it meant that they didn't have to deal with their own. And so I learned about the civil rights movement. I watched the PBS series, The Eyes on the Prize. That was always playing on the BBC. And so this was about 1980, between 85 and 1988. And at the same time, our cities were supposedly being devastated by crack cocaine. And so at that point, I had my sort of raison d'etre, you know, so I thought that my reason for being would be to help save my communities from crack cocaine. And so that's what I was going to do, and that's what I did. I started studying drugs. I really intensified my studies. I studied laboratory animals, primarily rats. I wanted to know about the brains of rats, how cocaine affected their brains, how morphine or heroin, how nicotine affected their brain. I started learning everything I could about drugs and how they affect the brains of rats. I got into a PhD program, went to the University of Wyoming, even more bizarre than Texas. But I got quite an education because there was nothing else to do in Wyoming besides go to school. I think I finished their graduate program in record time. I was there on paper for 4 years, but I was actually in Wyoming for about 2 years. And I had finished my degree, and I was at the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, in Bethesda for much of the time. In part because Wyoming was Wyoming. After I graduated, I took a postdoc. And postdoc is additional training after you get your PhD. Many people with PhDs have to do this postdoc training in order to get a job because after you get your PhD, at least in 1996, I think I was offered something like $21,000. Go to school and you're in poverty. You get a PhD and you're in poverty. So I took a postdoc, and my demeanor, I was excited. I was eager. My motto was, I didn't come to bow, I came to conquer. I was going to be an Ivy League tenured professor, even though I had never stepped foot on an Ivy League campus before. My relationship with my advisor was congenial. Each experiment I thought would be a potential paper in the top journals, JAMA, Nature. Night before the big results, I was preparing for the media interview. By the second year, things had changed a bit. My demeanor now was battle-hardened. My motto had changed to life's a marathon, not a sprint. I was now just hoping to get that job at TCCC. My relationship with my advisor now was guarded, and each experiment was a possible prelude to an important paper, and the night before the big result, I could be found at the local bar drunk. By the third year of this postdoc, my demeanor had changed considerably. I was now shell-shocked. And my motto had changed to the inmates has taken over the asylum, and the super Walmart night manager job was looking awfully good. My relationship with my advisor was hostile. Each experiment now was just a waste of taxpayers' money. And the night before the big result, I didn't even remember what the experiment was. Now, this sort of evolution happened as a result of me coming across things that challenged my thinking about drugs, about how American society works. I had a lot of cognitive dissonance, and I was not sure if I even wanted to do this anymore. But then I met a woman doing my third postdoc. This woman's name was Marion Fishman. She was the first person to give cocaine to humans in the lab and study the effects of cocaine. And she wrote a paper back in 1996 that showed that the effects of crack cocaine and powder cocaine, they were the same drug. And this paper moved me when I read it in 96. And I wanted to study with her, but I didn't think that I had an opportunity to. But when I actually met her and started working with her, she became even more impressive. She had been like the first woman to do a number of things. I can go down the list, but more important, she was one of those scientists who was concerned with social justice. In '68, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, she was out there on the front line, she got arrested, she did all of those sorts of things. So she was a world-class scientist, but she had a social consciousness. And she kind of made sure that I had one as well. I apologize. She died in 2001. I didn't expect to get choked up, you know. In any event, she had quite an influence on me. So I just want to say that the education that I got from her left me thinking a lot about the words of James Baldwin. James Baldwin said that the paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. And that happened to me. I really started to examine American society and really started to think about what my role is in this society. And started to think about the positions that I had taken, or the beliefs that I held about drugs. And what I like to do now is to share a few things that challenged my thinking. And in the end, after talking about these things, I like to propose what we should probably do. One of the initial things that challenged my thinking were myths about crack cocaine. I was taught that women who use crack cocaine during pregnancy, they were going to have babies that would be intellectually challenged for the rest of their lives. These babies would also be predators on our society. They couldn't learn. A wide range of stories were said about these babies. And then when all the data came in, it was just simply not true. The effects of cocaine on the child, on the developing fetus were about equivalent to the effects of tobacco or nicotine on a child. And the data, the evidence had been in for some time. Another thing that challenged my thinking was that one hit of crack cocaine, you were addicted. That's just simply not true. 20-some years of studying drugs, I can assure you that one hit of anything cannot cause addiction. Addiction, by definition, requires work. So that was just simply untrue. When I was an undergraduate, they told us that drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin was so powerfully addictive that laboratory animals, when you put an IV catheter, hook them up to an IV catheter and allow them to press a lever, they would kill themselves if you allowed the animal to do that. Sure enough, the animals would, that if you only allowed them to have access to a lever to receive these drugs and nothing else, they would. They have nothing else to do, they will kill themselves. But the minute you put in a sexually receptive mate, for example, the minute you put in a running wheel, some other sweet treat like sugar water or some other environmental enrichments, they are no longer as interested in the drugs. And you know what? So I thought it'd be interesting to do a study with crack cocaine users like that. So one of the earliest studies that we did was to bring crack cocaine addicts to the lab. Of course, we passed all the ethical requirements. And we provided them with options: choose crack cocaine or an alternative. In the first study, the alternatives were $5 cash or $5 merchandise vouchers. And what we saw was that they would choose money on about half of the occasions and drug on about the other half of the occasions. But when you increase the amount of money to something like $20 or so, they always chose the money. Evidence that this notion that crack cocaine was so powerfully addictive that people could not make rational decisions is just simply not true. I'll show some of those data tomorrow in my presentation. This work was recently featured in the New York Times because people now are starting to find it interesting, even though this work was done about 14 years ago. But now people are finally getting it. Another thing that challenged my thinking was that most of the people who use illicit drugs are not addicted. In fact, 80 to 90% of the people who use cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, they are not addicted. Only a small percentage of drug users are addicted, 10 to 20% or so. The typical drug user looks more like these guys. As you all know, Bill Clinton admitted to smoking marijuana, although it was begrudgingly and reluctantly. He admitted to smoking marijuana. George Bush, of course, admitted to smoking marijuana and is widely suspected of doing cocaine. Barack Obama admitted to smoking marijuana and using cocaine. And this is not to besmirch any of these guys' reputation, because despite your politics, one cannot argue that they all have made important contributions to the country. So that's not the goal here. The goal here is that all of these guys, if they were my children, I would be proud of, because they have reached the highest levels of success in a society, but they just happen to have used drugs. And so, as we think about the typical drug users, here they are. Another thing that challenged my thinking was the blatant racial discrimination in the application of our drug laws. I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but just to give you just a sort of teaser, if you will, think about black people in the United States. We make up about 12% of the population. We make up 14% of the drug-using population, 15% of the drug-abusing population, people who are addicted. But we make up 35% of the people who are arrested for drugs. We make up 55% of the people who are convicted for drugs. And we make up about 70% of the people who are sent to jail for drugs. So when you start to see these numbers, and tomorrow I'll talk a little bit about some of the policies that lead to these numbers. When you start to see these sort of numbers, you have to agree with Keith Richards when you think of the black situation. He said, let me be clear about this. I don't have a drug problem, I have a police problem. So one has to agree with Keith on that issue when we think about black people in the United States. Finally, just quickly, another thing that challenged my thinking when I started to think about all the money that we are spending on our drug control budget. I mean, now the budget is up to about $26 billion a year. Think about all that amount of money. Between 1970 and 2011, we've had like a 3,500% increase in spending, and we have had no effect on daily use of these substances. And daily use is kind of what we're really concerned about, because that's the sort of problematic use. And we haven't had any effect on those rates. But there again, the goal probably wasn't to decrease drug use. The goal are things that are unstated. When you spend that kind of money on law enforcement efforts, you should get some results, and we certainly got some results. When we think about what's happening in terms of arrests, the greatest number of arrests in this country, according to the FBI latest statistics, are for drug arrests. Each year we arrest about 1.5 million Americans for drug arrests. And sometimes people say, well, we're getting kingpins off the streets, and so that's a good thing. But 80% of the people who we are arresting are for simple possession. And so it's not even for the kingpins. All of those things have challenged my thinking to the point where it makes me believe and understand that we need to do something differently. And so here today, I don't have much time. I'm just going to talk about the legal sort of alternatives that I would suggest that we do. In my book, High Price, I argue that we should decriminalize all drugs. Now, when one says that we should decrease all drugs, I have to understand that you all have been so poorly educated about drugs that that sounds radical. It's not. But you have to read the book, you have to come to my talk tomorrow, and you have to see why that's not radical. It's not radical in part because we know a tremendous amount about drugs. As I have said on many occasions, I have 3 sons, 3 black male sons, and I would much prefer them take drugs than to interact with the police. I know how to keep them safe with drugs, but I don't know how to keep them safe with the police in some of these situations. When I think about what happened with Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman wasn't a police officer, but he was his local sort of security enforcement. He thought Trayvon Martin might have been under the influence of marijuana. There was a kid in the Bronx, 2-year anniversary now, Marley Graham, was shot and killed in his bathroom because the police thought he was selling marijuana on the corner. They followed him home and bust down the door as he was flushing marijuana down the toilet, shot him, killed him. These kind of interactions frighten me as a parent of black boys. Now, I know a lot about keeping kids safely with drugs. Now, obviously, for people who will say, well, you want your kids to do drugs? I don't want my kids to do drugs. I want my kids to be successful in life. That's number one. If they happen to do drugs, I know how to keep them safe. But first, they have to make sure that they are making their parents happy, like getting good grades in school. And by the way, my kids are doing well. The ones I've raised, they're doing well in school. And so the goal is not for them to do drugs, but I'm telling you, if I have a choice, that's the choice. Now, given that situation, I have argued that we should decriminalize drugs because we know a lot about keeping people safe with drugs. Alcohol is probably one of the most dangerous substances, and we have done a pretty good job in this society of keeping people safe. Of course, people have trouble with alcohol, but most of us know how to use it safely. Alcohol is the only recreational drug that one can die from by experiencing its withdrawal effects. Can't die from heroin withdrawal, despite the rubbish that you see on TV about heroin withdrawal and how awful it is. It's about like the flu. I mean, I don't like the flu, but it's certainly not deadly. And so when we think about the dangers of alcohol, and nicotine is also one of the most potentially dangerous substances to humans, because you only need a small amount, you can kill somebody with nicotine. We know how to keep people safe with those drugs, and we've done a pretty good job. And so when we think about heroin, crack cocaine, and all the rest of these things and the dangers associated with these drugs, we can keep people safe, but we have been irresponsible as a society. We haven't showed people how to be safe with those drugs. And many people say, what about heroin overdose? People are not dying from heroin overdose. They're dying because they combine the drug with alcohol or another sedative. 75% of the people who die from heroin overdose do so because they take it with alcohol. That's why they're dying. Or they're dying because people may be using prescription opioids, something like Vicodin and Percocet. They're dying because of the acetaminophen in those drugs, if they're abusing those drugs. Acetaminophen is the #1 reason for liver toxicity, but they put it in those drugs. They put them in those drugs in part because we want to stop people from abusing them. It would be like stopping people from speeding, from going faster than 55 by having your tires blow out in your car. It's kind of ridiculous, but this is how we have been behaving as a society when it comes to drugs. And so, I argue we should decriminalize everything. Decriminalization does not mean legalization. Not that I'm against legalization, but we can talk about that in a second. Decriminalization simply says that you treat these things like traffic violations. You know, you still send a message that we're not condoning drug use, but you don't ruin somebody's life by giving them a felony offense, by giving them a criminal record. Now, drug sales still remain illegal, but you would have to change the sort of enforcement, our current sort of cowboys and Indian focus, the way we do all of this undercover work with drugs. And that's another discussion. And so, that's what I would propose. But if you propose liberalizing drug policies in any sort of way, you have to have a corresponding increase in education. And tomorrow, I'll speak more about what type of drug education should look like. I think I've said enough provocative stuff for the day. I was only given 20 minutes. I think I've taken 3 hours. So thank you all for indulging.